She was the price of a reckless gamble, but the Duke who claimed her was far more dangerous. That morning, Essie Haynes learned everything. The fire in her room had gone cold. The window was pale with a thin winter light, and she was still in London. Still home. Still herself. The knock came twice, then 3 times, and then Thomas's voice. "Miss Essie. Please. You ought to come down." Thomas never said please. Her father was in the drawing room. The curtains had not been opened. The candles had burned themselves to nothing in their holders, leaving dark smears of wax across the silver. 3 glasses stood on the side table, empty. Wallace Haynes sat in the leather chair by the cold hearth, his hands pressed flat on his knees, his eyes fixed on the Persian rug. Essie made him look at her. "Father." The man lifted his head. His eyes were red, not from grief. From something older and shabbier than grief. "Sit down, Essie." She did not sit. Wallace said nothing more. He reached across the arm of the chair and lifted a document from the small table beside him. He held it toward her. His hand did not shake. She thought it should. Essie took the paper. She read it once. Read it again. On the 3rd pass she stopped because the room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears, and her hands had begun to tremble, and she would not let him see that. The document was formal. 2 names sat at the top of the page in the careful ink of a solicitor who would never know what he had written. Mr. Wallace Haynes. Below it, Mr. Fickle Smith, Duke of Hartwell. Then the debts, each one numbered, each one a small catastrophe listed without apology. And at the foot of the page 1 sentence, drawn up in the same clean, indifferent hand as all the rest. In return, Miss Essie Haynes, through marriage. Essie set the paper down on the table. Slowly. Carefully. As though it were something that could still be made harmless, if handled gently enough. "When?" she said. "Last night. A card game." Wallace looked toward the window. Essie turned. She crossed the room to the far wall and stood with her back to him and her eyes open, and inside her there was a storm. Anger that had no shape yet, fear that had no name, and beneath both of them, something that surprised her. Something cold and determined, like a decision already half made. She would meet him. The Duke of Hartwell, the man who had won her at a table as if she were a deed to a house. She would look at him. And then she would see exactly what kind of man collected debts this way. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. He arrived at 2 o'clock, which Essie thought was either very punctual or very deliberate. She had spent the morning doing practical things, packing a small case, eating breakfast standing up at the kitchen window because she had not yet decided to behave as though everything were normal, and composing, in her head, 17 different opening remarks. She discarded all 17. Too angry. Too frightened. Too much like a woman who had spent the morning composing opening remarks. She was in the front sitting room when the carriage came up the drive. She did not go to the window. She sat with a book open in her lap and her eyes on the door and her heart doing something she chose not to examine too closely. The door opened. Thomas announced him. Essie looked up. Her first thought was that someone had made a mistake. Dukes, in her limited experience of them, tended toward the soft and overfinished. Men who wore their wealth the way furniture wore upholstery, thickly and with great self-satisfaction. Fickle Smith was not that. He was tall in the way that reorganizes a room simply by entering it. Dark coat, dark eyes, the particular stillness of a man who had learned very early that he did not need to move to make people uncomfortable. He looked at her the way one looks at a contract, thoroughly and without sentiment. Essie looked back at him the way one looks at a painting one finds technically competent. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in his expression. She filed that away. He did not bow. She did not stand. They regarded each other across 8 feet of her mother's Persian rug with the particular courtesy of 2 people who have already decided not to pretend. "Miss Haynes," he said. His voice was low and even and gave nothing away. "Your Grace," she said. Then, because she could not entirely help herself, You are exactly on time. I find that either admirable or ominous. I haven't decided which. A pause. Brief. She watched him decide what to do with that and watched him decide correctly to do nothing. Her father materialized somewhere behind her left shoulder, already apologizing with his posture alone. Essie ignored him. She set the book aside and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the Duke with the expression she had been practicing since 6:30 that morning. Composed, unhurried, entirely unbothered, like a woman who had chosen this. I will come with you, she said. I will conduct myself as your wife in every way that can be observed by other people. I will not embarrass you, and I will not make scenes. She let that settle. In return, I will have my own rooms, my own hours, and a written agreement, separate from that document my father signed, stating that if either of us finds this arrangement unworkable after 1 year, it ends. Cleanly. Without consequence to me. The room was very quiet. Her father made a small sound that she did not acknowledge. Fickle Smith looked at her for a long moment. She had the uncomfortable sensation that he was recalculating something. You've thought about this, he said. I had the morning. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, with nothing in his face that she could name or use, agreed. He said it the way one signs something. Final. Unhesitating. As if he had not expected to agree and had surprised himself by doing so. Essie nodded once. She did not smile. Neither did he. Outside, the carriage waited. London went on around them, indifferent as ever. She thought, well, so this is how it begins. She brought one suitcase. It was a point of principle. Thomas had appeared at her bedroom door with 2 footmen and a look of quiet devastation, ready to begin the solemn business of packing her life into trunks. Essie had thanked him, dismissed the footmen, and packed the suitcase herself in 20 minutes. Dresses enough for a fortnight. Her mother's watch. 3 books she had not yet finished and 1 she had read 4 times and would not leave behind. She closed the case and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for exactly 1 minute. Then she picked it up and went downstairs. The Duke said nothing about the suitcase. He looked at it once and then looked away, which she decided to count as a victory. They did not speak for the first hour. The carriage moved north out of London and the city thinned around them. The noise, the press of buildings, the smell of coal smoke and wet cobblestone, until there was only road and sky and the occasional village that appeared briefly and then was gone. Essie watched it all from the window with her hands in her lap and her face arranged into something she hoped looked like serenity rather than the concentrated effort it actually was. Fickle Smith sat opposite her and read documents. He read them with great focus and no apparent awareness that she existed, which she found simultaneously relieving and obscurely irritating. By the second hour the sky had changed. She noticed it gradually, the light flattening, the blue draining out of it, the clouds coming in low and heavy from the north like something deliberate. The landscape opened up around them into wide empty stretches of moorland, gray-brown and wind-scoured, broken only by stone walls running in long lines across the hills as if someone had tried to impose order on it and mostly failed. It was, Essie thought, extraordinarily bleak. She found she did not entirely dislike it. She did not say this aloud. Smith Hall appeared at the end of the 4th hour, at the top of a long rise in the road, and Essie's first thought was that it had not so much been built as positioned, set into the landscape with the deliberate authority of something that intended to remain. It was vast and gray and almost entirely without ornament, the stone darkened by weather and time, the windows tall and sparing with their light. It looked, she thought, exactly like a house that belonged to a man who had arranged his entire life around the business of not being approached. The carriage stopped. A housekeeper appeared at the top of the stone steps, hands folded. Essie picked up her suitcase before the footman could reach it. She felt Fickle Smith look at her. She did not look back. She walked up the steps and through the door and into the cold, dim entrance hall of Smith Hall, and behind her the Yorkshire wind came in hard off the moor and pulled the door shut like a full stop. She was here now. Whatever here was going to mean. Chapter 4 Life at Smith Hall operated according to rules that nobody had written down and everybody understood. Breakfast at 7, served in the east dining room, eaten in silence. The Duke took his coffee black and read correspondence with the focused efficiency of a man who considered the morning a problem to be solved. Essie took her tea with 2 sugars and read whatever book she had brought down, and they sat at opposite ends of a table built for 14 and did not speak, which suited them both and which Essie privately found rather companionable, in the way that sharing a library with a stranger can be companionable if neither of you ruins it by talking. The house itself was immaculate and completely joyless. The housekeeper, Mrs. Albright, moved through it with the quiet authority of someone who had long since made her peace with grandeur and expected others to do the same. The staff were efficient and invisible in the particular way of well-trained servants, appearing precisely when required and dissolving back into the architecture immediately after. Everything was polished. Everything was cold. The fires were lit on schedule and went out on schedule, and somewhere in the walls the house made small sounds at night, settling into itself like an old argument. Essie explored systematically the way she did most things. The library on the 2nd floor was extraordinary. Floor to ceiling, 3 rolling ladders, entire shelves given over to mining law and land surveying and metallurgy, which told her things about Fickle Smith that he had not volunteered. She also found, tucked behind a volume on Yorkshire geology, a slim collection of French poetry so thoroughly underlined that it was practically a different text. She put it back without mentioning it to anyone. Some discoveries were better kept. She began to notice his habits the way one notices the weather. Not all at once but gradually, as patterns emerged from the days. He walked the grounds every evening at 5 regardless of the weather. Always the same route, always alone. He had strong opinions about which windows should be open and which should not, and Mrs. Albright executed these opinions without question. He never raised his voice. He was, Essie thought, the kind of man who had calculated long ago that silence was more effective than volume, and had been correct, and had never seen a reason to revisit the question. What she could not account for was the east wing. It ran off the north end of the house like an afterthought, or rather like a thought that had been deliberately set aside. The door at the corridor's end was heavy oak, older than the rest of the house's fittings, and it was always closed. Mrs. Albright, when asked, mentioned structural concerns with the expression of someone reciting something they had been told to say rather than something they believed. The ceiling, she explained. Unstable. The Duke had closed it off 3 years ago for safety. Essie nodded and thanked her and thought, 3 years is a very specific number. She walked past that door every evening on the way to her rooms. She did not try the handle. She was not ready to try the handle. But she looked at it each time, and each time she had the same sensation. Not quite dread, not quite curiosity, but something that lived in the narrow corridor between them. On the 9th evening she noticed something she had missed before. There was no dust on the door handle. In a wing that nobody entered. In a house where everything was otherwise immaculate. She walked on. She did not sleep particularly well. She went on a Tuesday because Tuesday felt like the kind of day on which consequences were marginally less severe. The Duke had ridden out at 9:30 to inspect the northern fields. She had watched the horse disappear into the gray morning from the library window, and Mrs. Albright was occupied with the quarterly linen inventory, which Essie had learned consumed the woman entirely and left the rest of the house pleasantly unsupervised. She took a candle. She told herself this was practical, given the structural concerns, and not at all the behavior of someone in a Gothic novel, and then she opened the door to the east wing and went in. It was cold. Not the scheduled, managed cold of the rest of Smith Hall, but something older and more settled, the cold of a space that had been left to its own devices and had made certain decisions about its atmosphere. The corridor was narrow, the wallpaper lifting at the seams in long pale curls, the floorboards registering every step with a candor that the rest of the house's floors entirely lacked. 2 doors on the left, both open, both empty except for sheeted furniture standing in the dimness like a congregation of very patient ghosts. The ceiling looked, she noted with clinical interest, completely fine. At the end of the corridor was a room, larger than the others, facing north, with 2 tall windows through which the more light came in flat and without warmth. It had been, she thought, a sitting room once. The bones of it were still there, the fireplace, the arrangement of space, the sense of a room that had been used and loved and then closed like a book mid-sentence. Against the far wall, beneath one of the windows, was a chest. Dark wood. Brass fittings, undecorated. Not locked. She opened it. Letters. Dozens of them, bound in 3 separate bundles with faded ribbon, the paper gone soft with age and handling. The handwriting on the uppermost envelope was small and precise and feminine, and it was addressed to nobody, or rather to everyone, the way diaries are addressed to everyone. Essie sat down on the cold floor, set the candle beside her, and began to read. Catherine Smith had been, it emerged, a woman of considerable intelligence and very controlled fury. The letters spanned 7 years. They were not addressed to Fickle. They were something between a journal and a legal record, written with the careful precision of someone who understood that one day they might matter. And they did matter. They mattered enormously. The land dispute began in 1871. A business partnership between 2 families, the Smiths and the Hayneses, in the northern mining territories. Wallace Haynes, described in Catherine's careful hand without epithet or embellishment but in a way that required neither, had over the course of 2 years falsified survey documents, redirected mineral rights, and systematically dismantled the partnership from the inside while presenting himself to the world as its most devoted member. The ancestral Smith lands, 300 acres of viable mining territory, had been absorbed into Haynes Holdings through paperwork so thoroughly corrupted that by the time Catherine had understood what had happened, the legal avenues for remedy had all been elegantly, deliberately closed. Catherine's last letter was dated 4 months before her death. "I am tired," she had written. But Fickle is not. He will remember. He remembers everything. Essie sat in the cold north room for a long time after that, the letters in her lap, the candle burning low, the Moor outside the window doing nothing helpful. She thought about her father. About the card game. About a debt that was not, she now understood, about money at all. She thought, this was never a gamble. This was the end of a very long plan. He was waiting for her. She knew it the moment she stepped back into the main corridor and found the east wing door open behind her. She had closed it, she was certain she had closed it, and then she turned and Fickle Smith was at the far end of the hall, still in his riding coat, watching her with a particular stillness that she had by now learned to distinguish from calm. It was not calm. It was the thing that lived beneath calm, held there by considerable effort and long practice. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward his study, which she understood to mean she was expected to follow. She followed. She still had one of Catherine's letters in her coat pocket. She did not mention this. The study was the warmest room in Smith Hall, which she had always found incongruous and now found explanatory. A man who kept the rest of his house cold to the bone had built himself one warm room and filled it with the things that mattered. Maps on the walls. Land surveys. A desk that had been worked at seriously and often. And on the far corner, half obscured by a stack of correspondence, a small portrait of a woman with precise handwriting eyes who could only be Catherine. Fickle stood at the window with his back to her. The moor beyond was darkening into evening. "You read them," he said. "Yes. All of them. Enough of them." A long silence. Outside, the wind came across the moor in a long flat note. "Then you understand," he said, "that this was not a card game." "No," Essie said. "It was a collection." He turned at that. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. She had noticed he did that when she said something he had not predicted, and she had begun to find the recalibration more informative than anything he said aloud. He told her then, standing in the last of the gray afternoon light, in the tone of a man reciting facts rather than grievances, what her father had done. She knew the outline already from Catherine's letters. But the letters had given her the history. Fickle gave her the weight of it. The survey documents falsified over 18 months, each one small enough to seem like an error, numerous enough to constitute a demolition. The legal challenges that went nowhere because the paperwork was impeccable and the magistrate was, by then, in Wallace Haynes's social orbit. The partnership dissolved. The Smith lands transferred. The family income that had underwritten Catherine's medical care quietly, thoroughly gone. She died in the 3rd year of the dispute, he said. The doctors said it was her heart. She was 51. He said it without inflection. That was, Essie had come to understand, how Fickle Smith communicated the things that had broken him, in the flattest possible voice, as though emotion were a structural weakness he could engineer around. I spent 8 years finding a way to make your father understand the precise dimensions of what he had taken, he said. The card game was the last step. I had been at that table with him for 2 years. The room was very quiet. And then, Essie said carefully, I walked in. You walked in. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression she could not name and had been failing to name for weeks. Something that had started as calculation and somewhere along the way had become considerably more complicated. I am not my father, she said. No, he said quietly. I am aware of that. He said it like a confession, like something that had been true for longer than he was comfortable with. London in December was all candlelight and performance, which suited them both, Essie thought, for entirely different reasons. They had been invited to the Ashford Winter Ball, invited being perhaps a generous word for what was in practice a summons, the kind of social obligation that arrived in cream envelopes and admitted no refusal. The Duke of Hartwell and his new wife. Essie had read the invitation twice and thought, so this is the part where we become a story other people tell. She wore her mother's garnets. It was the only jewellery she had brought, and she suspected it was insufficient for a duchess and did not particularly care. Fickle said nothing about the garnets when she came downstairs except to look at her for a moment in the way he had been looking at her lately. Quickly, and then away, as though prolonged contact with the sight of her was something to be managed. She had begun to find this extremely interesting. The ballroom was vast and overheated and full of people who wanted things from each other and were going about it in the most ornate way possible. Essie moved through it on Fickle's arm with her chin up and her expression pleasantly unreadable, which was the expression she had perfected over the past weeks and which she privately thought of as her Smith Hall face, the one that gave nothing away and cost her considerable energy to maintain. They were, she had to admit, convincing. He guided her through rooms with a hand at her back that was light and precise and always there, and she leaned into conversations with the easy authority of a woman who had chosen this, and somewhere between the third introduction and the supper room she realized they had developed, without discussing it, a fluency with each other that looked from the outside exactly like intimacy. She found Lady Ashford's portrait gallery at 9:30, having excused herself from a conversation about Shropshire drainage that she had no means of surviving with her dignity intact. The gallery was cool and quiet, and the portraits looked down at her with the impartiality of people who had been dead long enough to lose their opinions. She stopped in front of one without knowing why, and then knew exactly why. The woman in the portrait had Fickle's eyes and Fickle's stillness and the expression of someone who had loved the world carefully and been hurt by it anyway. A small brass plate on the frame read Catherine Smith, 1821 to 1872. Essie stood there for a long time. She thought about the letters. About 7 years of careful, controlled fury, and underneath it, unmistakably, a mother who had watched her son become someone defined entirely by what had been done to him. Catherine had documented the injustice with meticulous precision, but the last letters, the ones written when she already knew she was dying, had not been about the land or the documents or the money. They had been about Fickle, about the worry that he would spend his life collecting a debt that, once paid, would leave him with nothing. Don't let it be the whole of you, she had written. It would be a waste of a very considerable person. Essie looked at Catherine's painted eyes and thought, she would have hated this. Not the revenge. She had earned the right to want the revenge. But this. A girl with her mother's garnets and nowhere to put her suitcase standing in a gallery wondering which version of the man at the end of the hall was the real one. Catherine Smith had not written 7 years of letters so her son could win a card game and call it justice. Fickle appeared at the gallery entrance. He looked at the portrait, then at her. She said, she wouldn't have wanted this, would she? It was not a question. He knew it was not a question. The silence that followed was the longest and most honest one they had yet managed. She had taken the letter from the chest on a Tuesday and carried it in her coat pocket for 3 weeks without quite deciding what to do with it. It had traveled with her to London in her single suitcase, tucked between the unfinished book and her mother's watch, and she had taken it out twice in the carriage and put it away again both times without reading it, because it was not hers to read more than once and she had already read it more than once. She found him on the balcony. The ball was still happening inside. She could hear it, the music and the movement and the particular hum of a room full of people performing contentment. But out here there was only the cold London night and Fickle standing at the stone railing with his coat on and his eyes on the middle distance, which was where his eyes went when he was thinking about something he had not resolved. She had learned to read him. She was not sure when that had happened. She stood beside him and they looked out at the dark city together for a moment without speaking, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and then she reached into her pocket and held the letter out without preamble because she had found that with Fickle Smith, preamble was a form of distance. He looked at it. He recognized the handwriting immediately. She watched it happen in the set of his jaw, the almost imperceptible stillness that came over him when something cost him something. "The last one," she said. "I should have given it to you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." He took it. He did not open it immediately. He held it in both hands with the careful attention of someone handling something irreplaceable, which it was, and looked at it for a long moment in the thin light coming through the balcony doors. Then he read it. She looked away and gave him the privacy of it, watching the street below where a single carriage moved through the lamplight and vanished. The silence afterward was different from their other silences. Fuller. Like a room after someone has said the thing that needed saying. "She knew," he said finally, "what I was going to do." "Yes." "And she still—" He stopped. He looked down at the letter. "She still called it a waste." "She called you a very considerable person," Essie said. That was the point she was making. He was quiet for a long time. Below them London moved through its evening, indifferent as ever, and inside the music shifted into something slower. "I want you to know," he said, in the voice he used for things that cost him, "that there is not a version of this I am proud of. The card game. The contract. Bringing you into something you had no part in making." He paused. Asterisk, "You were not supposed to be." Asterisk, he stopped again, and she understood he was navigating the distance between what he meant and what he was prepared to say. "You were a means to an end. That is what I told myself." "And now," Essie said carefully. He turned and looked at her. In the cold London light with his mother's last letter in his hand, Fickle Smith looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man without a strategy. "Now," he said, "I find I cannot finish that sentence the way I started it." The music drifted out from inside. Neither of them moved. She thought, "There it is. There is the real one." They returned to Smith Hall on a Friday, which felt right. London had been performance. Yorkshire was the truth of things. The moor received them without ceremony, as it always did, grey and vast and entirely unimpressed by whatever had happened in the south. Essie watched it through the carriage window and felt, with some surprise, the particular loosening that belongs to arriving somewhere that has become, without your full consent, familiar. The stone walls running across the hills. The flat winter light. The house at the top of the rise, dark and permanent, and hers, in whatever complicated sense of the word currently applied. She did not examine the feeling too closely. She had learned that some things were better approached from the corner of the eye. Wallace arrived on the Sunday. She saw the carriage from the library window and felt something tighten in her chest. Not the storm of Chapter 1, not the fury that had no shape yet, but something older and sadder and more honest than fury. She went downstairs. Fickle was already in the entrance hall, and he looked at her once with a question in it, and she gave him the smallest nod, which meant, "I am all right, and also, stay." He stayed. Her father looked diminished. That was the only word for it. Wallace Haynes had always occupied space with the confident imprecision of a man who had never seriously considered consequences, but the man who stood in the entrance hall of Smith Hall had clearly been considering them for some weeks and found the experience aging. He was thinner. His eyes, when they found hers, had the carefully prepared look of someone who had rehearsed this and knew the rehearsal was insufficient. "Essie," he said. "Father," she said. He apologized. It took some time and covered considerable ground and was, she thought, genuinely meant, which made it harder rather than easier. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a courtesy she was not certain he had earned but extended anyway, because she was not her father and she intended to keep being not her father as a matter of principle. When he had finished, she said, "I know. And I need you to know that I understand what you did and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I am not going to spend my life being defined by it either." Wallace nodded. He looked at Fickle Smith over her shoulder with the expression of a man acknowledging a debt that money cannot settle, and Fickle looked back at him with something that was not forgiveness yet but was perhaps the room in which forgiveness might eventually be built. It was enough. For now it was enough. Her father left before supper. Afterward the house was very quiet. Essie stood in the library with a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked out at the moor going dark under a sky full of the particular purple that Yorkshire saved for its best winter evenings, and she heard Fickle come in and stop behind her. "The agreement," he said. 1 year. It has been 11 weeks. I am aware. You are under no obligation. Fickle, she said. He stopped. She turned and looked at him. This man who had fallen first and hidden it badly and loved his mother fiercely and built himself a warm room in a cold house and underlined French poetry when he thought no one was looking. And she said, "I am not leaving." Something in his face came undone, very quietly, like a lock opening. "Right," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Besides," she said, because she could not help it and because he needed it and because the humor was not armor anymore, it was just hers, "I have only unpacked half my suitcase. It would be extremely inconvenient." Fickle Smith looked at her for a long moment. And then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled. Not the recalibration, not the controlled almost expression she had catalogued over 11 weeks. A real one. It rearranged his face entirely, and she thought, There it is. Worth every bit of the wait. Outside the Yorkshire dark came in full and soft across the moor, and inside Smith Hall, for the first time in a very long time, the quiet felt like something chosen rather than something endured. And that is where we leave them. Essie Haynes, one suitcase half unpacked, and Fickle Smith, a man who spent a decade building a revenge and ended up building a home instead. She came as a debt. She stayed as a choice. And somewhere in the cold quiet of Smith Hall, between forbidden letters and a London balcony and a smile that rearranged everything, they found each other. Not perfectly. Not without cost. But truly. That, I think, is the only kind of love worth writing about. If this story found you, held you, made you stay up past the hour you intended, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button and let me know this kind of story is worth telling. Every like tells me you want more slow burns, more sharp heroines, more dukes who fall first and fall hard and spend 6 chapters trying to look like they haven't. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, the next forbidden wing, the next impossible contract, the next 2 people in a cold house figuring out how to choose each other. And the notification bell. Press it. Because the next story is already waiting, and I would hate for you to arrive late. Thank you for reading. Thank you for staying until the suitcase got unpacked. See you in the next one.